Some stories begin with a warning. This one began with silence. In the summer of 2019. Two siblings found themselves standing in front of a house they had not visited in nearly 15 years. The old Victorian estate sat on a hill overlooking the rocky coastline of Maine. Its paint peeling, its windows dark, its garden wild and overgrown. Their grandmother had lived here alone for decades, and now she was gone. Callum was 32 years old. He worked as a professional pianist in Boston, performing with orchestras and teaching students on the side. His younger sister Iris was 28, a librarian who had always been more practical, more grounded. They had grown up hearing stories about this house, about their grandmother's quiet life by the sea, but they had never truly known her. She had always kept her distance from the family, and no one ever understood why. Now she had left them everything. The lawyer had called it a modest inheritance. The house, the land, and whatever remained inside. There was no money to speak of. Their grandmother had lived simply, almost like she was hiding from something. Callum and Iris had driven up from Boston together, expecting to spend a weekend sorting through old furniture and dusty boxes. They had no idea what was waiting for them. The house smelled like salt and old wood when they stepped inside. Dust floated in the pale light that came through the curtains. Everything was exactly as their grandmother had left it. Her reading glasses sat on the kitchen table. Her coat still hung by the door. It felt less like she had passed away and more like she had simply stepped out and never come back. They spent the first day going through the main rooms. There were old books, faded photographs, and furniture that had seen better days. Nothing unusual. Nothing that explained why their grandmother had chosen to live so far from everyone who loved her. On the second day, Iris suggested they check the attic. The staircase leading up was narrow and creaked with every step. The attic itself was cramped and filled with shadows. Boxes were stacked against the walls, some of them falling apart from age. There were old lamps, broken chairs, and trunks that looked like they had not been opened in half a century. Callum was about to suggest they call it a day when Iris found something strange. She had been going through an old steamer trunk in the corner, the kind people used to travel with on ships. It was heavy and covered in peeling leather. Inside were old clothes, yellowed letters, and a few pieces of costume jewelry. But when Iris lifted out the last layer of fabric, she noticed something odd. The bottom of the trunk did not match its depth. There was a gap. She knocked on it gently. It was hollow. It took them 10 minutes to figure out how to open it. There was a hidden latch on the side, rusted but still functional. When the false bottom finally lifted away, they found a leather portfolio tucked inside. It was old, cracked along the edges, and tied shut with a faded ribbon. Iris handed it to Callum. He untied the ribbon carefully, almost afraid to damage whatever was inside. When he opened the portfolio, his breath caught in his throat. Sheet music. Handwritten sheet music, page after page, filled with notes and markings in dark ink. The paper was so old it had turned the color of weak tea. At the top of the first page, written in elegant cursive, was a title, Whispers from the Shore. Below the title was a name, Theodora Ashworth, and a date, 1897. Callum had spent his entire life studying music. He had played pieces by composers both famous and forgotten, but he had never heard of Theodora Ashworth. The name meant nothing to him. He looked at Iris. She shook her head. She had never heard of her either. They brought the portfolio downstairs and spread the pages across the dining room table. There were 12 sheets in total, covered in dense musical notation. Callum studied them carefully, his trained eye moving across the staff lines, reading the melody in his mind. Even without playing a single note, he could tell this was something special. The composition was complex, layered, and deeply emotional. It was the kind of piece that could make an audience weep, but there was something else about it. something he could not quite explain. The music felt heavy somehow, like it carried a weight that went beyond the notes on the page. Looking at it made his chest feel tight. That night, Callum sat down at their grandmother's old piano in the living room. It was out of tune and had not been played in years, but it still worked. He placed the first page of sheet music on the stand and began to play. The melody that filled the room was unlike anything he had ever heard. It was beautiful, yes, but also deeply sad. It made him think of loss, of longing, of standing on the edge of something vast and unknowable. The notes seemed to pull at something inside him, something he did not know was there. When he finished the first page, he realized his hands were shaking. Iris had been standing in the doorway, watching. Her face was pale. Where did this come from? She whispered. Callum did not have an answer. Over the next few days, they searched for information about Theodora Ashworth. Callum reached out to colleagues, professors, music historians. Iris spent hours at the local library and searching online databases. They found nothing. No records of performances. No mention in any music journal. No birth certificate. No death certificate. No obituary. It was as if Theodora Ashworth had never existed. But the music was real. Someone had written it. Someone had hidden it in that trunk, in that attic, in that house by the sea. And their grandmother had kept it secret for her entire life. Why? Callum kept coming back to that question. Their grandmother had never played piano. She had never shown any interest in music. So why did she have this composition hidden away like it was something precious? Or something dangerous? He tried asking other family members. His mother, his aunts, his cousins. None of them knew anything about Theodora Ashworth. None of them even knew the portfolio existed. Their grandmother had never mentioned it to anyone. The more Callum played the piece, the more obsessed he became. He would sit at the piano for hours, working through the difficult passages, trying to master every note. The music was challenging in ways he had not expected. Certain sections felt almost impossible, like they were written for hands that moved differently than human hands should. But he kept practicing, kept pushing, kept playing. Iris watched her brother with growing concern. She could see the change in him. He was sleeping less, eating less, talking less. All he wanted to do was play that piece. One evening, she found him sitting at the piano in the dark, not playing, just staring at the sheet music. "Callum," she said softly, "maybe we should put it away for a while." He did not look at her. "I need to understand it," he said. "I need to know why she hid it." Iris did not argue. But deep down, she felt something she could not explain. A sense of unease that had been growing since the moment they opened that trunk. Something about that music was wrong. She just did not know what yet. 3 months passed, and Callum could not let go. He had returned to Boston with the sheet music tucked carefully into his bag. Iris had stayed behind for another week to finish sorting through the estate, but Callum could not wait. He needed a proper piano. He needed to understand this piece fully, to feel every note under his fingers, to hear it the way it was meant to be heard. Back in his apartment, he played it every single day. Sometimes for an hour, sometimes for 5. His neighbors started to complain about the noise, but he barely noticed. The music had taken hold of him in a way nothing else ever had. The composition was 12 minutes long when played at the correct tempo. 12 minutes of the most emotionally demanding music Callum had ever encountered. There were passages that made his heart ache with sadness. There were moments that filled him with a strange kind of fear, though he could not explain why. And there were sections that felt almost impossible to play, like the notes were fighting against his hands. He had performed difficult pieces before. He had tackled Rachmaninoff, Liszt, and Chopin at their most challenging. But this was different. This music did not want to be played. It resisted him at every turn. Still, He kept going. By the end of September, he had finally mastered it. Every note, every rest, every subtle shift in dynamics. He could play whispers from the shore from memory, his fingers moving across the keys like water flowing over stones. It was the hardest thing he had ever learned, and he was proud of what he had accomplished, but something had changed in him during those 3 months. Iris noticed it when she came to visit. He had lost weight. His eyes looked tired, almost hollow. He talked less than he used to, and when he did speak, it was almost always about the music. "You need to take a break," she told him one evening. "This is not healthy." Callum shook his head. "You do not understand. This piece is important. It deserves to be heard." "Why?" Iris asked. "We do not even know who wrote it. We do not know anything about Theodora Ashworth." "That is exactly why," Callum said. "She created something beautiful, and the world forgot her. I want to change that." He had already made up his mind. He was going to perform the piece publicly. He had contacted a small recital hall in Portland, the same city where their grandmother's estate was located. It felt right somehow, like the music was meant to return to where it had been hidden for so long. The performance was scheduled for October 15th. Iris tried to talk him out of it, but Callum would not listen. He was convinced this was what he was supposed to do. He had found the music for a reason. He was meant to bring it back to life. The night of the concert arrived cold and clear. The recital hall was modest, with wooden seats and soft lighting. It could hold about 200 people, and nearly every seat was filled. Most of the audience were locals, curious about the mysterious lost composition that had been advertised in the event flyers. A few of Callum's colleagues from Boston had made the drive as well. Iris sat in the front row, her hands clasped tightly in her lap. She had a bad feeling about this. She had felt it ever since they found that trunk in the attic. But she did not know how to explain it, so she stayed quiet. Callum walked onto the stage in a simple black suit. He looked calm, focused, like he always did before a performance. He sat down at the grand piano and adjusted the bench. Then he placed his hands on the keys and began to play. The first notes drifted through the hall, like mist rolling in from the sea. Soft, gentle, almost hesitant. The melody was simple at first, a quiet theme that repeated with slight variations. But as the piece progressed, it began to grow. New layers were added, harmonies that clashed and resolved, rhythms that pushed forward and pulled back. The audience sat in complete silence. Iris watched her brother play, and she felt something strange happening inside her chest. It was like the music was reaching into her, pulling at emotions she did not know she had. She thought about their grandmother, alone in that house for all those years. She thought about the woman who had written this piece, forgotten by history. She thought about loss and loneliness and the things we hide from the people we love. Tears began to fall down her cheeks. She did not wipe them away. Around her, she noticed others were crying too. A man in the row behind her had his head bowed, his shoulders shaking. A woman near the aisle had her hand pressed over her mouth, her eyes closed. Even the older gentleman who had been checking his phone before the concert began was now sitting perfectly still, tears streaming down his face. The music built and built, reaching a climax that seemed to shake the very walls of the hall. And then, slowly, it began to fade. The melody returned, softer now, like a whisper disappearing into the wind. The final note hung in the air for what felt like forever, and then there was silence. No one moved. No one spoke. No one applauded. Callum sat at the piano, his hands still resting on the keys, his head bowed. For a long moment, it seemed like the entire room had stopped breathing. Then, slowly, people began to stir. A few quiet coughs, the rustle of clothing. Someone in the back stood up and walked out without a word. Others followed. Within minutes, half the audience had left, not in anger, but in something that looked more like shock. Those who remained eventually began to clap, but it was hesitant, uncertain. Like they were not sure if applause was the right response to what they had just experienced. Iris rushed backstage after the concert ended. She found Callum sitting alone in a small dressing room, staring at the wall. "Are you okay?" she asked. He looked up at her, and for a moment, she did not recognize her own brother. His eyes were distant, unfocused, like he was seeing something far away. "Did you feel it?" he asked quietly. "Feel what?" He shook his head slowly. "I do not know how to explain it. While I was playing, I felt like someone was standing behind me, watching, listening." Iris felt a chill run down her spine. "There was no one there, Callum. I was watching the whole time." He did not respond. They drove back to Boston that night in near silence. Callum seemed lost in his own thoughts, and Iris did not know what to say. She kept thinking about the audience, about the way people had cried, about the strange heaviness that had filled the room during the performance. When they finally arrived at Callum's apartment, it was almost midnight. He checked his email while Iris made tea in the kitchen. She heard him go quiet, and something about the silence made her walk back into the living room. "What is it?" she asked. Callum was staring at his laptop screen, his face pale. "Someone sent me an email," he said. "No name, no return address. Just one line." Iris leaned over his shoulder and read the message. "You should not have played that." She felt her stomach drop. "It is probably just a prank," she said, trying to keep her voice steady. Someone from the audience who thought it would be funny. Callum did not answer. He just kept staring at the screen. That night, he dreamed of a woman standing on a cliff above the ocean. Her hair was dark and wild, blown by a wind he could not feel. She was looking out at the water, watching something in the distance. Ships, maybe. Or something else. She turned to look at him, and her eyes were filled with sorrow. When he woke up, his pillow was damp with seawater. And the smell of salt lingered in his room. Long after the sun came up, the dreams did not stop. Every night for the next 2 weeks, Callum found himself standing on those same cliffs. The wind howled around him, cold and sharp, carrying the smell of salt and seaweed. Below, the ocean crashed against the rocks with a sound like thunder. And always, always, the woman was there. She never spoke. She just stood at the edge, looking out at the water, her dark hair tangled by the wind. Sometimes she would turn and look at him, and her eyes would be so full of sadness that he would wake up with tears on his face. Other times, she would raise her hand and point toward the horizon, like she was trying to show him something he could not see. He tried to talk to her once. In the dream, he walked toward her, his feet sinking into the wet grass, and called out to her. "Who are you? What do you want from me?" She turned to face him. Her lips moved, but no sound came out. Or maybe there was sound, but the wind swallowed it before it could reach him. She looked frustrated, almost desperate, like there was something important she needed him to understand. Then he woke up, and his sheets were soaked with seawater. Iris came to visit him at the end of October. She had been worried about him since the concert, and her worry had only grown over the past few weeks. He barely answered her calls anymore. When he did pick up, he sounded distracted, distant, like his mind was somewhere else entirely. When she walked into his apartment, she understood why. The place was a mess. Dishes were piled in the sink. Clothes were scattered across the floor. The curtains were drawn, blocking out the daylight. And in the middle of it all, Callum sat at his piano, playing the same piece over and over again. Whispers from the shore. He did not stop when she came in. He did not even look up. His fingers moved across the keys like they had a mind of their own, and his eyes were fixed on something she could not see. "Callum," she said, louder than she meant to. he stopped playing. For a moment, he just sat there, his hands hovering above the keys. Then he turned to look at her, and she felt her heart break a little. He looked terrible. His face was pale and thin. There were dark circles under his eyes, like he had not slept in days. His hair was unwashed, his clothes wrinkled. This was not the brother she knew. This was someone else entirely. "Iris," he said, his voice rough. "When did you get here?" "Just now." "Callum, what is going on with you?" He shook his head slowly. "I cannot explain it. The music, it will not let me go." She wanted to argue with him, to tell him he was being ridiculous. But the look in his eyes stopped her. He was not being dramatic. He was genuinely afraid. She spent the next 3 days with him, trying to help him get back to normal. She cleaned his apartment, made him eat proper meals, forced him to go outside and get some fresh air. But every time she turned around, he was back at the piano, playing that same haunting melody. On the second night, something strange happened. Iris was sitting on the couch, scrolling through her phone when she heard a knock at the door. She looked at Callum, but he was lost in his music, oblivious to everything around him. So she got up and answered it herself. There was no one there. Just an envelope lying on the doormat. She picked it up and opened it. Inside was a single sheet of paper with a handwritten note. "I heard you play. I have been dreaming of the cliffs ever since." Who is the woman? Why does she cry? There was no signature, no return address. Just those words, written in shaky handwriting. Iris felt a chill crawl up her spine. Over the next few days, more letters arrived. Some were left at the door. Others came through the mail. All of them said similar things. People had heard Callum's performance. Someone had recorded it on their phone and uploaded it to the internet without his permission. The video had spread quietly, passed from person to person, viewed by thousands. And everyone who listened to it was having the same dreams. The cliffs, the ocean, the woman with dark hair. They all saw her. They all felt her sadness. Some of them woke up with the taste of salt on their lips. Others heard the sound of waves crashing even when they were miles from the sea. Callum read every letter with a mixture of horror and fascination. He was not alone. Other people were experiencing the same thing. The music was doing something to them, something none of them could understand. Iris did not know what to make of it. Part of her wanted to believe there was a rational explanation. Maybe it was some kind of mass suggestion, a psychological phenomenon triggered by the emotional power of the music. But another part of her, a part she did not want to listen to, whispered that something else was happening. Something that could not be explained by science. She decided to do some digging of her own. Using her skills as a librarian, she reached out to archivists, historians, and researchers across the country. She searched old databases, digitized records, and forgotten collections. For days, she found nothing. Theodora Ashworth remained a ghost, a name without a history. Then, on the 5th day, she received an email from a music historian at Yale University. The woman's name was Dr. Adeline Cross. She was in her 60s. A respected scholar who specialized in obscure composers of the 19th century. She had seen Iris's inquiries on an academic forum and wanted to help. "I found something," Dr. Cross wrote. "It is not much, but it might be useful. Can we talk?" They arranged a phone call for that evening. Iris sat in Callum's living room, her phone pressed to her ear, while her brother played softly in the background. Dr. Cross's voice was calm but serious. "I have been researching forgotten composers for over 30 years, she said. "I have never heard of Theodora Ashworth, but I found one reference to her name, buried in a psychiatric journal from 1901. Iris felt her grip tighten on the phone. "What did it say?" It was a brief mention in a case study about patients who claimed to have supernatural experiences. Theodora Ashworth was admitted to an asylum in Maine in the spring of 1901. She was in her early 40s at the time. According to the records, she was a composer who had stopped performing years earlier. Why was she admitted? Dr. Cross paused. She told the doctors that her music could open doors that should remain closed. She believed that one of her compositions had the power to summon something from the other side. She begged them to destroy her work, but they dismissed her as delusional. Iris's mouth went dry. What happened to her? That is the strange part, Dr. Cross said. 3 days after she was admitted, she vanished. She was there one night, and the next morning, her room was empty. The window was still locked from the inside. The door had not been opened. She simply disappeared, and no one ever saw her again. Iris looked at her brother, still playing at the piano, his eyes closed, his body swaying gently with the music. Dr. Cross, she said quietly, we found her music. My brother has been playing it, and people are starting to have dreams. There was a long silence on the other end of the line. Then I suggest you stop, Dr. Cross finally said, before it is too late. But even as Iris heard those words, she knew the truth. It was already too late. Iris knew she had to go back to the house. After her conversation with Dr. Cross, she could not shake the feeling that the answers they needed were hidden somewhere in their grandmother's estate. They had searched the attic, but they had not looked everywhere. There had to be more. Letters, photographs, something that would explain how their grandmother had come to possess that music in the first place. She told Callum she was going back to Maine for a few days. He barely responded. He was sitting at the piano again, though he was not playing. He was just staring at the keys, his fingers resting lightly on the ivory, his lips moving slightly like he was talking to someone. She could not see Dot. It scared her more than she wanted to admit. The drive to Maine took 4 hours. Iris arrived at the old Victorian house just as the sun was beginning to set, painting the sky in shades of orange and pink. The house looked the same as it had months ago, tall and weathered, standing alone on the hill above the sea. But now it felt different. Now it felt like it was waiting for her. She let herself in with the key they had kept and turned on the lights. The electricity still worked, thankfully. The house was cold and quiet, filled with the smell of dust and old wood. She could hear the ocean in the distance, the steady rhythm of waves against the shore. She started in their grandmother's bedroom. It was a simple room with a narrow bed, a wooden dresser, and a small closet. There were a few books on the nightstand, mostly novels and poetry collections. The walls were bare, except for a single framed photograph of the coastline. Iris searched through the dresser drawers, finding only old clothes and linens. Then she checked the closet. Behind the hanging dresses and coats, pushed into the far corner, she found a wooden box. It was about the size of a shoebox, made of dark polished wood with a small brass latch. She had never seen it before. She carried it to the bed and sat down. Her hands trembled slightly as she opened the latch and lifted the lid. Inside were letters, dozens of them, tied together with faded ribbon. There were also a few photographs and a small leather journal. Iris picked up the photographs first. The first one showed their grandmother as a young woman, maybe in her early 20s. She was standing in front of this very house, smiling at the camera, her hair pinned back in the style of the 1950s. Iris recognized her immediately. She had seen this face in old family albums. The second photograph made her heart stop. It showed their grandmother again, older now, perhaps in her late 20s or early 30s. She was standing beside another woman. This woman was elderly, with white hair pulled back in a severe bun and deep lines carved into her face. Her eyes were dark and intense, filled with something that looked like both wisdom and sorrow. Iris turned the photograph over. On the back, in their grandmother's familiar handwriting, were the words, "With Great Aunt Theodora." She made me promise Iris read the words 3 times, making sure she understood Great-Aunt Theodora. Theodora Ashworth had not vanished. She had not disappeared into thin air from that asylum in 1901. She had been hidden, protected, kept secret by her own family. And there, grandmother had been her guardian. Iris set the photograph aside and reached for the letters. Her hands were shaking now, but she forced herself to stay calm. She needed to understand what had happened. She needed to know the truth. The letters were arranged in chronological order, spanning several decades. Most of them were written by their grandmother, addressed to various family members, discussing ordinary things like holidays and birthdays and family gatherings. But scattered among them were other letters, written in a different hand. An older hand. A hand that trembled slightly, making the letters uneven and slanted. These were from Theodora. Iris read them one by one, piecing together the story like a puzzle. Theodora had escaped from the asylum in 1901, but not through any door or window. She had simply walked out while the staff was distracted, disguised in the clothes of a visiting nurse. A cousin had been waiting for her outside with a carriage. They had driven through the night to a small farmhouse in the countryside, where Theodora had lived in hiding for the next several years. Eventually, when the search for her had died down, she had been moved to the house by the sea. Their grandmother's family had owned it for generations. It was remote, isolated, the perfect place to hide someone who did not want to be found. Theodora had lived there for nearly 50 years. She had watched the world change through her window, seen 2 world wars come and go, watched automobiles replace horses and telephones replace letters. But she had never left the property. She had never played music again. She had never spoken to anyone outside the family. She had died in 1952 at the age of 93. Their grandmother had been with her at the end. Iris found the final letter at the bottom of the box. It was different from the others. The paper was thicker, older, and the handwriting was steadier, like it had been written with great care and concentration. It was addressed to no one in particular. It was simply titled, "For whoever finds this. Iris began to read. If you are reading this, then I am gone, and the music has been found. I prayed this day would never come. I prayed that it would stay hidden forever, buried in the darkness where it belongs. But some things cannot be buried. Some things find their way back to the light, no matter how deep you try to hide them. My name is Theodora Ashworth. I was born in 1859, in a small village on the coast of Maine. I showed talent for music at a young age, and my family sacrificed everything to give me the education I needed. By the time I was 20, I was performing in concert halls across the country. By the time I was 30, I was considered one of the finest pianists of my generation. But I was not satisfied. I wanted to create something truly extraordinary, something that would last forever, something that would touch the souls of everyone who heard it. In the summer of 1897, I nearly got my wish. I was walking along the cliffs near my family's summer home when I slipped on the wet rocks and fell into the sea. The water was cold, colder than anything I had ever felt. I tried to swim, but the current was too strong. It pulled me down into the darkness. I drowned that day. My heart stopped beating for 7 minutes before a fisherman pulled me from the water and brought me back to life. But something came back with me. When I opened my eyes on that rocky shore, the music was already in my head. Every note, every chord, every rest. It was complete, fully formed, like it had been waiting inside me all along. I did not compose whispers from the shore. I received it. It was given to me by something I cannot name, something that lives in the space between life and death. I wrote it down because I could not stop myself. And then I played it once, alone in my studio, with no one else to hear. That was when the dreams began. I saw a door. A door made of water and shadow, standing at the edge of the sea. Every time I played the piece, the door opened a little wider. And every time it opened, something on the other side moved closer. I do not know what waits beyond that door. I do not want to know. But I know this. The music is a key. And if it is played enough times, in front of enough people, the door will open completely. I stopped playing. I hid the music. I spent the rest of my life making sure it would never be found. But if you are reading this, then I have failed. Please, I beg you, destroy it. Destroy all of it. Burn the pages and scatter the ashes in the sea. Do not let the door open. Some things are not meant to be heard. Some doors are not meant to be opened. Iris set the letter down. Her hands were trembling. Her heart was pounding in her chest. She thought about Callum, alone in his apartment, playing that piece over and over again. She thought about the thousands of people who had listened to the recording online. She thought about all those letters, all those people having the same dreams. The door was opening. And she had no idea how to close it. Iris drove back to Boston that same night. She did not stop to rest. She did not stop to eat. She pushed through the darkness with Theodora's letter sitting on the passenger seat beside her. The words burned into her mind. Destroy it. Burn the pages. Do not let the door open. She had to make Callum understand. She had to make him stop. When she arrived at his apartment, it was nearly 3 in the morning. She pounded on the door until he finally opened it. He looked worse than before. His skin was pale, almost gray. His eyes were red and sunken. He moved slowly, like a man walking through water. "Iris," he said. His voice was barely a whisper. "You came back." She pushed past him into the apartment and turned on every light she could find. The place was even messier than before. Empty cups and plates were scattered everywhere. The curtains were still drawn, and the piano sat in the corner like a dark altar. The sheet music spread across the stand. "You have to stop playing," she said. "You have to destroy the music. All of it." Callum stared at her. "What are you talking about?" She told him everything. She told him about the wooden box, about the letters, about the photograph of their grandmother with Theodora. She told him about Theodora's near drowning, about the 7 minutes she spent dead beneath the waves, about the music that came back with her from the other side. She read him the letter, every word, her voice shaking as she reached the end. When she finished, Callum was silent for a long time. Then he shook his head. "She was unwell," he said quietly. "She spent years hiding from the world, convinced that her music was dangerous." "That does not make it true. Callum, people are having the same dreams. You are having the same dreams. You wake up with seawater on your pillow. How do you explain that?" "I cannot explain it," he admitted. "But that does not mean it is supernatural. There has to be a rational explanation. Maybe it is some kind of shared psychological experience. Maybe the music triggers something in the brain that causes vivid dreams." Iris wanted to scream. "And the seawater? The salt in your lips? The smell of the ocean in your room?" He did not answer. He just turned and looked at the piano. "I cannot destroy it," he said finally. "I will not. This music is a masterpiece. Theodora created something extraordinary, and I will not let her fear erase it from history." Her fear was not irrational. She experienced something we do not understand. Or she experienced a mental breakdown after a traumatic near-death experience. He turned back to face her. "I am not going to argue about this. I have already made my decision." Iris felt her heart sink. "What decision?" "I have been in contact with a concert hall in Boston. Symphony Hall. They have agreed to let me perform the piece on December 21st. The winter solstice. It felt right somehow. The longest night of the year. Callum, no. It is already arranged. The tickets have been selling faster than they expected. Over 2,000 people will be there. Iris grabbed his arm. Listen to me. Theodora said the music is a key. Every time it is played, the door opens a little more. If you perform it in front of 2,000 people, you could be opening it all the way. Or I could be giving the world a beautiful piece of music that deserves to be heard. He pulled his arm away gently. I know you are scared. I am scared too. But I cannot let fear control my life. I have to see this through. Nothing she said could change his mind. She argued with him for hours, but he would not budge. In the end, she left his apartment feeling more helpless than she had ever felt in her life. The weeks leading up to the concert passed in a blur. Iris tried everything she could think of. She contacted Dr. Cross, hoping the historian might have some way to convince Callum. She reached out to other family members, begging them to intervene. She even considered going to the police, but what would she tell them? That her brother was about to perform a haunted piano piece that might open a door to another dimension. No one would believe her. December 21st arrived cold and gray. Snow had fallen the night before, covering the city in a thin white blanket. Symphony Hall stood tall and elegant in the fading afternoon light, its windows glowing warmly against the winter sky. Iris sat in the front row, just as she had at the recital in Portland. But this time, the hall was packed. Over 2,000 people filled the seats, their voices creating a low hum of anticipation. Many of them had heard the recording online. Many of them had experienced the dreams. They had come to hear the music for themselves, to feel whatever it was that had touched so many others. Callum walked onto the stage at exactly 8 o'clock. He was wearing a black suit, the same one he had worn at the first performance. He looked thin, fragile, like a candle that had burned too long. But his eyes were clear and his steps were steady. He sat down at the grand piano. He adjusted the bench. He placed his hands on the keys, and he began to play. The music filled the hall like a living thing. It wrapped around the audience, pulled them in, held them tight. Iris felt it immediately, that same overwhelming wave of emotion she had experienced before. Sadness, longing, a deep, aching sense of loss that seemed to come from somewhere far away. Around her, people began to cry. Some closed their eyes. Others gripped the armrests of their seats like they were afraid they might float away. The piece built slowly, layer upon layer, the melody weaving through harmonies that seemed impossible, rhythms that pushed and pulled like the tide. Callum played with his eyes closed, his body swaying, his fingers moving across the keys with a grace that seemed almost inhuman. And then, as the music reached its final crescendo, every light in the building went dark. The music stopped. The hall was plunged into complete blackness. People gasped. Someone screamed. Iris heard the sound of chairs scraping, voices rising in confusion and fear. Then she heard something else, a voice. Faint, distant, like it was coming from very far away. A woman's voice, singing a melody she recognized. The same melody Callum had been playing. The emergency lights flickered on, casting the hall in a dim red glow. Iris looked at the stage. The piano bench was empty. Callum was gone. She ran to the stage, her heart pounding, her breath coming in short, sharp gasps. She climbed the steps and approached the piano, hoping to find some explanation, some sign of where her brother had gone. What she found instead made her legs give out beneath her. There was seawater pooled beneath the piano keys. It dripped slowly onto the floor, forming a small puddle that reflected the red emergency lights. The sheet music was gone. Every page had vanished, leaving only the empty stand. And in the air, faint but unmistakable, was the smell of salt and fog. the investigation lasted for months. Police searched the building from top to bottom. They interviewed every witness, reviewed every security camera. They found no evidence of foul play, no sign of forced exit, no explanation for how a man could simply disappear from a stage in front of 2,000 people. Callum was never found. Iris sold the estate in Maine. She gave away most of her grandmother's belongings. She moved to a small town in the mountains, as far from the ocean as she could get. She never spoke publicly about what happened that night. She never told anyone the full story. But sometimes, late at night, when the wind is still and the world is quiet, she hears it. Faint piano music, drifting from somewhere she cannot see. A melody that makes her heart ache with sadness. And sometimes, when she wakes in the morning, there is a trace of salt on her pillow. Somewhere, the door is still open, and the music is still playing.